quite beautiful, isn't it? Today we're making a response to some of the people who responded to my last video called Intelligent Design and Plasticine. You guys remember this? Alright, so far no one has responded to any of the points that I made in my last video, so no point in repeating them. However, some of the people who did respond to it made some points which were, well, I've kind of mentioned them in earlier videos, but I just wanted to do them again, so might as well. One guy said, well, if the Earth, or life, needs to be created because it's complex, wouldn't God need to be created because he is complex? Well, the answer, quite frankly, is no, but allow me to explain why. Anything that begins to exist must have a cause. If something always existed, it has no cause, and therefore always existed. Now, we've already established that something always existed because either everything came from nothing, which is impossible. I find myself repeating this like, you've probably heard me say this over and over again. Either everything came from nothing, which is impossible, or something always existed. Now, let's figure out what always existed. Either it's God, or maybe it's everything that does exist, the universe. Well, I've already refuted that the possibility of it being the universe by way of contingency. We exist in a world of causality. That means something happens, and then the next thing happens, so on and so forth. If you go backwards, okay, if you go backwards, you need to eventually come to a first cause that has no cause. Otherwise, you have an infinite regression, which is impossible. Also, if you are to say that the universe always existed in its complexity, now some people will say, well, the universe isn't complex. Well, complexity in terms of numbers. The number 2 is 100% more complex than the number 1. The number 3, the number 4, so that's more complex. Now, how many atoms exist in the world? A lot. A lot. Trillions. Actually, trillions of trillions of trillions. Like, a number so astronomically high that it's kind of, you can't even say it. But even so, it's still a finite number because you can only have a finite amount, or sorry, you cannot have an infinite amount of finite things. So the question is this: has a finite amount of matter always existed? And to always exist is a property of infinity, because eternality is an infinite. So is it possible that a finite amount of matter always existed, or a finite amount of atoms always existed, or is it more likely that an infinite being, in his complexity, always existed? I'm inclined to say an infinite eternal being always existed, because since matter itself is finite, and has the properties of finiteness, it cannot therefore be infinite or eternal. So, something infinite always existed. That is God. And that should pretty much answer the question. So does God need to have been created or designed? No, because he is the infinite, eternal being that always existed, that created everything that is created. Simple as that. Anything that begins to exist, or anything that is shaped and formed, like this thing, anything that changes, must have a cause. God never changes, because he always existed, and he exists outside of time. So he has always existed in his infinite complexity. It is kind of mind-blowing, but again, either everything came from nothing, which is impossible, or something always existed. Okay, so the next one, a guy named Goat, and this video cracked me up. He said, okay, we who are intelligent design believers are guilty, he says, of saying stuff like this: the eye is complex, therefore it must have a designer. Which seems like common sense to me, because even as Darwin said, and he says we like to quote this, and yeah, we do. Darwin said, and the quote is longer than I'm going to say it, he simply said, to imagine that the eye could form by gradual processes of natural selection seems, he confesses, absurd in the highest degree. And yeah, that is absurd. Now, the guy who said this quote, Goat, he elaborated on the point, and he said that the full quote goes on to explain that Darwin imagined that the eye could gradually change and become more complex over time, so long as, and Goat says this, so long as each gradual step is useful. That was what he said. And the way he goes about proving that, well, he doesn't. I simply say this: okay, try removing part of your eyeball, maybe take a knife, dig it in a little, you know, maybe cut some of the cords at the back. Tell me how useful that'll be to you. It won't. You said, and you were right, Goat, you said that a watch, if you remove any gear from the watch, the whole thing stops working. Okay. Start removing stuff from your eyeball. See how long that works. Now you say, well, we see many different eyeballs. You see octopus with eyeballs for underwater, and you see fish which have, you know, their eyes are like glazed over because they're in the dark and stuff like that. So the usefulness has degraded. Well, number one, all that proves is God designed a whole bunch of different eyeballs. That does not mean we have a common ancestor with them. It just means God designed a bunch of different eyeballs, and fish losing the ability to use their eyeballs, or going to an environment where seeing is no longer required, thus their eyeballs over progressive generations becomes less emphasized or less useful. That's not evolution either. So start removing parts of your eyeball and tell me how long that works for you. Ridiculous. So, yeah, none of the points I made in my last video were refuted. They still hold. The fact is, this was created, even though it's not particularly complex. This Earth is incredibly complex, and you want to believe that it's formed by random chance? Life is incredibly complex. You want me to believe that it formed by chance? I'm sorry, I don't buy it. Now, here's another point that I've never made. Okay, imagine, you guys can see some trees in the background, right? Okay, imagine an intelligence in a laboratory had all the necessary things to make a fertile seed from scratch, not from any progressive generations. They just took some minerals, they took some elements, they put them together intelligently, made a seed, planted it, it made a tree. So that tree, let's say that was the tree that came from this manufactured seed. So it doesn't have millions of years of generations behind it. It's just one, or maybe 2 generations. Let's say it had a seed, it grew a tree, that tree produced seed, and created that tree. So that tree is 2 generations old, okay? How would you be able to tell the difference between that tree and another tree? You really wouldn't. My point is this: even if every other planet and every other star in the universe formed all by chance, which it didn't, but whatever, let's say it did, that does not mean that the Earth formed that way. In the same way, let's say by random variation that my shoe formed by chance. Does that mean every other shoe on the planet formed by chance too? Nope. So, atheists, you don't have a leg to stand on. Because this planet did not form by chance. And you can't prove otherwise. And you know, it really comes down to this, and this is the cool thing. Human beings are quite unique, and we are so unique. Check this out. Have you ever heard of Helen Keller? She was born deaf, blind, and mute. You know, atheists like to say they have a fascination with nature, so let's look at the human creature. Helen Keller could not communicate with anyone, and yet, when she learned to communicate, she said that for her whole life she had this belief in God. This belief in a higher being. It seems like it's an innate idea in man. That's why communities, separated, worlds apart, or entire nations apart, countries apart, whatever, they all come to this belief in God. Why is that? Now, their understanding of that God changes, but it's still this belief in God. It seems like it's part of our cognition. Children intuitively know that there's a God. They just take it for granted. So what is it in the human mind? Why would evolution design us in such a way, if evolution were to be true? Why would it design the human creature with a capacity, or even this preset, where the majority of the population came to this idea of God seemingly innately? Now, if there is a God and He made us with that cognitive ability, which makes sense if we are created by God and God expects us to know Him, that He would create us with that capacity, then atheism is actually a mental disability, mental retardation. I see we have a few minutes. Now, just, you know, I'm not trying to be inflammatory and say that atheists are retarded, because I used to be an atheist, so how do I account for that? Well, basically, the Bible teaches, you know, here we are in the fall, you can see the trees are falling off the leaves. We got a minute to explain this. Let me wrap this up really quickly. God created a perfect world, and He wanted to have a relationship with mankind. To have a relationship, mankind had to have free will. Mankind used their free will and violated the morality of God by disobeying Him, and thus creation began to fall away from God. So everything about humanity, everything about creation is decaying. That's where sickness, pain, and death, as well as atheism, came in. By the grace of God, we can overcome that, though. So, yeah. Just open your heart. Honestly look around. Look at your fellow man. See the image of God in them. We're not animals. We're not even close to animals. And you'll come to the knowledge of the truth, I guarantee you. God bless you guys. Oh, and check out part 1 of this video. So, this is part 2. Go check out part 1.